We are back, and we are joined once again by Luke Savage, a journalist, writer from Canada, writer in many places like Jacobin, The Washington Post, The Toronto Star. You can also find him on Substack. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Luke.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, since we last spoke, we were talking a little bit about the dire circumstances that the Liberals in Canada were in. Trudeau has stepped aside and is going to step aside essentially as the leader of the Liberals. Bradley, can we pull up this chart? Because you can see when we were having our conversation. Do we have the table at the bottom with? Yeah. So we can see these polling averages. The Conservatives, as of last week, this is from The Guardian, are at 39.7%, but you see that dip, and whew, the Liberals right around January shooting up. The NDP is going down, and that's a little concerning. I want to talk about that with you. But what happened basically? Is it really just the two punch of Trudeau stepping aside and Trump just going after Canada and reinvigorating Canadian nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you've about covered it, and I can hop off the interview right now.
Need more context.
Well, I mean, I think broadly speaking, that's true. With it's a number of caveats, and it's not everything you've alluded to there is, I think, obviously, it explains or goes some way to explaining that chart and the kind of direction of travel we're seeing. It's just not exactly clear yet kind of in what proportion and kind of where this is going to end up. So, the Conservatives have enjoyed a huge lead in the polls for several years now. I mean, they've been looking at a double-digit victory of a kind that's really unprecedented in the history of the modern Conservative Party. And actually, there are some polls that have the Liberals even closer to them than in the the poll that you just showed. I think there was one from Ecos that had the Tory lead down to about 5 points, so just in the single digits. And I think Justin Trudeau leaving is a major factor in this. He really was, hugely unpopular. And I think to a greater extent than most Liberal leaders, or than even many other Liberal leaders, he has been personally synonymous with the Liberal Party and the Liberal brand really since 2013. So it's been a long time. And he'd accrued a lot of political baggage. So I think just not having him there has made a pretty substantial difference. And I mean, as you also alluded to this, but I mean, Trump's tariff threats, the annexationist rhetoric, that has completely changed Canada's political dynamic. There is a kind of ferment going on that I was really not expecting to see. You have, conservative premiers, threatening to ban American liquor sales, joining the federal government in, these threats of massive retaliatory tariffs if Trump proceeds with the ones he's threatened. So all of this has kind of led to this unexpected resurgence, I suppose, of Canadian nationalism, and the Liberals seem to be benefiting from it, particularly from voters who are over the age of 60, who are now more than twice as likely to vote Liberal, according to one recent poll, as our younger Canadians. So that's what seems to be driving a lot of this shift in the polls.
It's fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about Trudeau's political baggage and what that entailed prior to, and then we can talk a bit about Mark Carney and the potential new Liberal leadership?
Sure. I mean, there's, the story I think goes back quite a ways, and we probably don't have time to get into it in too much detail, but obviously Trudeau was a hugely popular figure sort of globally after he won in 2015. By 2019, which was his second election as Liberal leader, that had sort of withered. And that was also when the revelations about, him doing blackface more times than he cared to name came out. They came out right in the middle of that election. The Liberals lost the popular vote in that election. They lost it again in 2021. So they formed a government with, I think, about 33% of the popular vote, which, I think was the weakest popular mandate of any Canadian federal government since at least 1945 and probably ever. So Trudeau's been unpopular for some time. I mean, there was a lot of stuff during COVID, I think, that contributed to that unpopularity. But I think his brand, the sense of an exciting, new leader who was going to be some sort of a transformative figure, I never bought that, but lots of people did, and I think they were disappointed when it turned out that wasn't the case. I think all of that baggage was really dragging down the Liberals. And then also there is this, it's a horrendous cost of living crisis. I mean, it's just, it's most Canadian cities like your own are increasingly unlivable. Food is vastly more expensive and other basic necessities are vastly more expensive than they were even a few years ago. So, that was always going to hurt the incumbent government, and Trudeau sort of became the catch-all signifier, if you want, for a lot of what was making voters frustrated about the state of the country.
And it's striking. I mean, of course, it's the same continent, but how similar the issues that are plaguing the United States are to what's happening in Canada in terms of cost of living and housing in particular. But we elected Donald Trump and I guess Elon Musk as co-president. And at the very least, it seems like our neighbors up north may benefit from it, because if polls continue in this direction, like I saw that Poilievre wants an election as soon as possible, because he wants this trend not to not continue. But it seems like if Trump continues to triple down on his trade wars, like this is not going to go away, at least from the perspective of Liberals being able to use this sense of nationalism to their benefit. I mean, there's massive hockey fights breaking out over this. Yeah, and the Star Spangled Banner getting booed at the Bell Centre in Montreal, that kind of thing. I mean, the Tories, it's worth saying, I mean, they are in the process of completely rejigging their strategy. I mean, whenever the federal election happens, and it will probably happen very soon, they are not going to be able to fight it on the terrain that they've been planning to for years. This was going to be for them a cost of living election. It was going to be a Justin Trudeau election, and now it's going to be a nationalism and dealing with Trump election, or that's how it seems. And you might think that a nationalism election would benefit, whatever the country or the context, that would kind of naturally redound to the benefit of a right of center party. In Canada, that's not really the case, particularly given that so much of the catalyst for this is coming from a right-wing president in the United States. Trump is less unpopular, after the election anyway. Last year's election, there were polls that said that, Trump was a little less unpopular in Canada than he'd been after 2016, but he's still incredibly unpopular. Canadians in every election in my lifetime have overwhelmingly preferred the Democrat in elections. We're talking 70% or higher. And, being associated with the Republican Party, with American kind of, American style conservatism has historically been like kryptonite to the Conservative Party, which is why they often run these very kind of, safe campaigns that try to just sort of triangulate away from that. And it seems like they're not going to be able to do that. And, they're in the midst of a pretty difficult transition, and we'll have to see how well their readjustment works. How are some of the conservative premiers like Doug Ford reacting to this? Like, what are the Tories doing from a party messaging standpoint to combat this? Because as you say, Poilievre's in a tricky position. He'd been kind of praising Trump prior to this. And I mean, even some of the conservative grassroots stuff from the pandemic, like the trucker convoy, was very MAGA in their organizing. So they're in a bind.
Yes. I mean, Doug Ford's response has been to completely pivot away from Trump, to put on a Buy Canadian hat, to just, I don't know, really just, I guess, meet Trump's bravado with a lot of sort of performative bravado of his own. And as shallow as that is, it's, it seems to have resonated with people. Out west, there's an exception because Danielle Smith, the premier of Alberta, she's been, I think, kind of the major exception in Canada in terms of, people with power anyway, in taking the line that, well, we should just sort of try to get along with Trump. We should try to appease him. He's got legitimate concerns, et cetera, et cetera. That reflects the fact that a lot of the kind of most hardcore parts of the Tory base are in Western Canada. They're in rural BC, they're in Alberta, and they are kind of MAGA-fied, but they represent a minority of the Canadian electorate, but a substantial portion of the Tory base. So there's a lot of difficult things the Tories, they're facing quite a dilemma at the moment.
The Quebec Party, the Nationalist Party, how have they reacted to the Trump tariff threats?
That's a good question, and I actually don't know enough to answer in detail. My sense is that they've been largely on side with the federal government's response, though I'd have to look into it some more. It is interesting because historically, and this seems counterintuitive, but Quebec has actually been a more pro-American part of Canada in some ways. Quebec was actually a place where in 1988, when there was a federal election fought more or less exclusively over the issue of free trade, Quebec was the one province where that had majority support. It was quite unpopular, much more unpopular in English Canada.
I was reading that
strange, but
they would be particularly affected by tariffs because they're, in the aluminum industry, and that was I don't know. That might be that was one of the subjects of Trump's tariffs that he was talking about. So that's just my interest in watching that there.
Yeah, I mean, it's very likely, and I mean, it's worth underscoring how much of Canada's economy is built around natural resources, and the extent to which over the past kind of 30 or 40 years in particular, the natural resource economy has been directly linked to the American economy as this sort of extractive, export-based kind of system. And so Trump's tariff threats, if there's a reason why the Canadian political class is reacting so strongly to those threats, it's because this is a direct kind of violation, a direct transgression against that consensus. And yeah, I mean, this is, I think, one of the reasons why, we've been talking about the polls, but there may be more profound shifts in, Canadian culture and society as a result of this. I don't think there's any precedent for the United States, Canada's, by far its biggest trading partner, suddenly trying to renegotiate the entire, North American economic settlement in a matter of a few weeks.
Right. Especially after when Trump was last in office, they had supposedly settled this with an agreement that he signed. But no, not anymore, because it's time for some performative BS here. So Mark Carney, the polling that you're talking about basically shows that if he were the Liberal leader, he's almost tied with Poilievre already. And that's why Poilievre wants those elections so soon. Can you give us a sense of who he is, why there's excitement around him? Because when I read that he's a former central banker, it's not necessarily the thing that would get me excited as someone on the left. But it seems like he's at the very least been able to harness some energy that Trudeau had lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think your skeptical impulse there is warranted. I mean, for those who aren't familiar with Carney, he's the former governor not only of the Bank of Canada but also the Bank of England. He does seem to be the front runner in the Liberal leadership race. Chrystia Freeland, who, Emma, I think the last time we talked in December, she was one of the people we were talking about, or the main person we were talking about. She seems to have calculated that if she resigned from cabinet abruptly and set herself up as the heir apparent, she was kind of going to walk into the, she was going to walk into the prime minister's office, win the Liberal leadership, no problem. And that just doesn't seem to be happening at all. There are polls which have Carney, these kind of speculative or hypothetical polls. If Carney was Liberal leader, how would the electorate hypothetically vote? Those sorts of polls, I think, especially this far out from an election when he's not actually the leader, I would take them with a grain of salt, but they do clearly indicate something. In terms of what his appeal is, I think part of it is actually that he is for many people, a relatively unknown and kind of an untested figure. He's never held elected office. He is a central banker, yes, but he's also, having followed him for some years, he's been a public figure for more than a decade. He's a central banker who's been very good at sort of building up his brand as someone who's like, yes, a technocrat, but a socially conscious one. Back in the day, he referred to Occupy Wall Street as something that was constructive. There was a major Canadian Auto Workers Convention he spoke at once. So, you've got he's someone who talks about climate change and that sort of thing. But, he's also a banker, which kind of means that he's safe as well, if that makes sense. So I think right now there's a craving for novelty, a yearning for novelty among a lot of the Canadian electorate and parts of the media class as well. And I think he's really capitalizing on that. And in some ways, he should be a perfect candidate for the Tories to run against because he's a banker. He's a Davos guy. He's someone they can associate with the World Economic Forum and fairly do so, I should say. But right now he seems to be he seems poised to win the Liberal leadership and then possibly make an election that the Tories have seemed destined to win for several years into at least some kind of a contest.
And then the status of the NDP, that same poll that we showed them dipping in support, the Left Party. Would they, I guess, still be likely conference, if the Liberals were to win a lot or it to be, close, would they be trying to form a government again with the Liberal Party? And also, why are they lagging in support in a time where a lot of left ideas, I think, are gaining some ground?
Yeah, I think the Tories have been the ones to capitalize the most on the cost of living crisis. And part of that is that the NDP entered, and I think we talked about this in December, the NDP entered into a confidence and supply arrangement with the Liberals. So, it wasn't a coalition government. There weren't NDP cabinet ministers, but the NDP agreed to support the Liberals in exchange, on confidence motions anyway, in exchange for a number of concessions. And, the Tories, I think, were really able to exploit this as, they referred to the NDP coalition a lot. That was kind of in common parlance. I think Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, when the agreement was negotiated and signed, there were a lot of pictures of him, smiling alongside Justin Trudeau. And I think that became a problem, given the cost of living crisis and how unpopular Justin Trudeau himself became. And, Carney, for I think many of the reasons I was just saying, he's the kind of Liberal leader who I think can pose a problem for the NDP because he's the type of Liberal leader who is safe to kind of, centrists and corporate interests, relatively safe. But he's also a guy who can kind of make progressive noises when he needs to. And there are, I say as someone having canvassed for the NDP many times in downtown Toronto, there are all kinds of voters that the NDP needs to win seats in downtown Toronto and elsewhere who are, progressively minded, but are very receptive to the kinds of, the kinds of messages that somebody like Mark Carney is currently expressing. So, we're not at the federal election yet. We'll have to see what happens. But, in so many ways, this is not where I expected things to be in, February of 2025.
And lastly, when do you anticipate elections will happen? And I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing. It's Poilievre. Thank you, Kyle, from Montreal, for writing in to correct me. He obviously doesn't want the elections soon. Is there a timeline? What is the feeling right now?
Well, the election was set to be later this year anyway. But I think that, I would assume if Carney wins, I'm not sure if he's commented on this lately, I expect he'll call an election very quickly. And if he doesn't call an election, the opposition parties will almost certainly vote the government down because both the NDP and the Tories have been have said they would do just that. So Parliament is set. The Liberals are voting for a new leader in early March. Parliament will reconvene, I think, during the second last week or the last week of that month. And I'd be astonished if there wasn't a confidence motion that brings the government down, or Carney or whoever's the Liberal leader trying to preempt an opposition motion just simply by calling an election, which, our elections, as you might have noticed, are a little shorter than your own. Americans seem to be in election mode most of the time. Ours last, 4 to 6 weeks. And so I guess that would put us in election, sometime in April or maybe early May. So we're talking pretty soon.
All right. Well, yes, I prefer that system for many reasons. But Luke, thanks so much for your time today. You can check him out. His writing, we're on Substack. Look up Luke's social media, find his work there. Thanks so much. Really appreciate you explaining this all to us.
Thanks, Emma. See you again.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.